This is Lecture 3 in the International Human Rights course. And what I'd like to reflect on today is the initial lecture in the 217th Massey Lectures in Canada. Massey Lectures are considered our most distinguished annual lectures in Canada that deal with usually pertinent themes, whether ecological issues, human rights issues, political issues, literary issues, educational issues, economic issues, a whole range of the significant issues that affect people at a personal, local, larger national, and international level itself. And in 2017, I.H.R. gave the Massey Lectures called In Search of a Better World, a Human Rights Odyssey. And in those lectures, he unpacked very clearly the nature of his own personal journey. He was a Baha'i from Iran, and having to flee Iran and then coming to Canada, going on and getting a degree in international law and human rights, and then in much of his life being active at a legal, political level in challenging states in which these basic rights were violated. And so what I'd like to touch on today, last week I looked at China, the whole nature of their understanding of community, the collective, and the role of the community and individual rights. I lightly touched down on Russia, and particularly Olga Ivskaya, who was one of the first prisoners adopted by Amnesty International, who was very much connected to Boris Pasternak, Dr. Zhivago. And of course we can follow up what's going on in Russia today in terms of Russia itself has a collectivist history and the implications of that for Muslims in Russia and many others in that fact for Russia. And of course one of the reasons the United Nations is in Latvia right now is because of Putin's aggressive stance in Crimea and what has happened there. And so just as in China, so as in Russia, there's a certain collectivist understanding of rights in which when the individual dares to protest, there is pretty severe and quick responses. We find the same thing happening in Belarus today, which is particularly the leader of that country, very connected to Putin and the elections which went on there and the huge protests that are occurring in Belarus now opposing the leader who many feel has very much distorted the nature of elections and the repression that goes on there. Even though obviously there's still freedom in the political civil sphere, the future very much hinges on what goes on in Belarus, and Putin, I'm sure, is watching very closely the events there. The EU has not accepted the results of the elections, nor has many others. And so one can have at one level what seems to be at a political and civil level free elections, and yet to what degree are they valid when monitored by outside forces? And in this case Belarus is very much on the front stage for many. But today I want to reflect on, and the text we're going to be using for this course is In Search of a Better World, a Human Rights Odyssey by I.H.R. And as I mentioned earlier in my first lecture, there tend to be three major rights which are acknowledged on the political right, three major rights which are acknowledged on the political left, and then ecological rights which transcend, in one sense, the ideology of right and left. So the first generation of rights is very much a part of the honoring and respecting of political, civil, and legal rights, in which all citizens, being equal, rational, and good conscience, should have the right, in principle, to form political parties, to belong to political parties, to gather as groups without interfering from the state if they are in opposition to state policy without fear of police or military coming in, the freedom of publication, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement. These are all part of civil rights and legal rights themselves, which people should have access to fair and prompt trials. Some trials are fair but not prompt, others are prompt but not fair. And so this first generation of rights, of political, civil, and legal rights, is in China. And what I didn't mention last week is also China's eye, obviously, on Taiwan, and that will be very interesting to see how that unfolds in the next few years, because China, obviously, in the last 2 decades is probably one of the fastest growing economic superpowers in the world. And of course its military is continuing to expand, and even though in principle it for those who are entrepreneurs, they do very well, but entrepreneurs are not allowed in any significant way to question the political nature of how China is run. Interestingly enough, with the COVID crisis, even though emerging in China, many will argue the strength of a command down political structure as they have dealt with the COVID crisis in a much more consistent way that has really minimized the spread of the COVID in a way many of the what are considered free countries that are allowed political, civil, legal rights have not. So the United States, for example, with its high elements and commitment to freedom and liberty and political and civil rights and freedom of movement, it's at the forefront of the COVID epidemic. And so it raises some interesting issues in terms of what is the legitimacy under certain situations and crisis. In fact, a strong government which intervenes in citizens' lives for the purpose of, in this case, health stability, versus one that says we're going to respect the freedom of people to assemble, to not wear masks, to gather, and then we are seeing the serious tragedy of that playing itself out when freedom comes to dominate in any sort of state organization or involvement is seen as coordinated. That is the problem. But let me return to In Search of a Better World, Payam Akavan. Last week I did mention Russia and China and the issue of political, civil, legal rights. I'd like this week, given the fact the course is on international human rights, to look at the Middle East and 3 countries in the Middle East itself and their human rights records when it comes to political, civil, and legal rights. Given the fact Akavan is Iranian by birth, his initial focus in Search of a Better World, a Human Rights Odyssey, begins with Iran. Iran's got a very interesting history in that sense. Payam makes an interesting point in his first lecture, which you will get to in your readings. The West often flatters itself on being the origin and the source of human rights thinking. But Payam mentions that, and certainly the Cyrus Cylinder and Cyrus the Great Persian, when he defeated the Babylonians, it was he who took the position that in fact people could return to their homeland. So the Jews returned to Palestine. In fact, in the Jewish text of Esther and Mordecai become key figures in the Persian Empire of Cyrus. And so here you have a situation in which Cyrus, one of the great Persian leaders, seems to embody freedom of movement, freedom of religion, freedom to gather as he defeated the Babylonian and the whole rise of the Medes and the Persians. And so Akavan takes the position that even though the West takes credit for inventing rights and the respect for people to gather, to return to their homelands, in fact, the discovery of the Cyrus Cylinder and Cyrus himself, there was immense openness and generosity to people of different ethnic, religious, political backgrounds and a returning of them to practice and live the lives they saw fit. And then, of course, the biblical story of Esther reflects how even the Jews under Cyrus played a very significant role, and Haman was the one who threatened all this in the book of Esther. But Iran has a fascinating history in that, certainly in the early part of the 20th century, oil became one of the prominent means of energy, and of course the English and the Russians got in there very quickly. It became a bumper crop for many, and the investments by the Russians and the British in Iran took the position that, in fact, increasingly so, this was their mother lode. This is where they were going to make a lot of money. But by 1953, actually earlier, the sheer wealth that was emerging from Iran, Mossadegh was elected as the prime minister in 1953, and he sought to nationalize the oil for the Iranians. This then led to immense reactions from the West, in which oil was their bread and butter in many ways in Iran, as well as Saudi Arabia, one of the great sources. The CIA launched a coup. So here you can see you get the West on the one hand talks about the respect for political civil rights, but it's often for their own people to some degree. But when it comes to larger investments such as oil, they're quite willing to interfere with the freedom of others in duly and accepted elections, which brought Mossadegh to power. Mossadegh sought to nationalize the oil. And so these big powers that on the one hand hold high political and civil rights for their own people, when it comes to others, they're quite willing to violate political, civil, and legal rights when economics is at work, in this case oil. So in 1953, a CIA coup brought in the Shah family, the Pahlavi family, and really from 1953 to 1979, Iran was really, for the most part, a Western plaything in which oil was flowed freely to the West. And the Shah himself, for those who dared to protest, Sabak, the insidious military, would very quickly, people would disappear. Amnesty International, once again, from the 1961 forward, certainly made it very clear that the secret police in Iran would brook no political or civil opposition to the Shah's affluent rule, indulgent rule, in fact. And so, but the Baha'i tradition within Iran was generally accepted, Iran being a Muslim country broadly, but underneath that Muslim tradition was the Persian Zoroastrian tradition. By 1979, there had been immense resistance in Iran, and this brought Khomeini and the rise of the right of center form of Shia Islam, which has persisted to this day, in which, again, meaningful political civil rights within Iran are thwarted constantly. So there's this tension in Iran today between, on the one hand, this overlay of a form of Islam which very much limits rights, and then the liberal tradition, which in a constrained way under the Shah, very, very much people agitate for change. And so this is what Iran has been considered, for some in the West, a certain view of rights, as one of the axis of evils. Obviously North Korea was the other one, as well as Iran and Iraq for a time. Pahlavi's, or Payam's argument then is that his very experience as a Baha'i in Iran was one in which, under the Shah, provided the Baha'i were not too vocal politically, they experienced considerable freedom of worship to exist. But with the coming of the more right-of-center Shia form of Islam under Khomeini, those rights were increasingly minimized, and hence the huge exodus from Iran in the 1970s. So in British Columbia, particularly in the North Shore, it's called Little Iran, in which there's a very large Iranian community who fled with the coming of Khomeini to power. And also the censorship that has taken place. Anyone who's had a chance to read Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, as a result of that work of Salman Rushdie coming out of the 90s, a fatwa was launched against Rushdie, and he had to go into hiding for quite a few years as a fear of his death itself. So when we think of human rights in Iran under the Shah, I mean, first of all, as I mentioned, under Mossadegh, the nationalizing of oil, even though the West talks about political, civil, legal rights, when their larger economic interests are threatened, they often will ignore that in other countries. Hence the CIA coup in 1953. And then under the Shah, there were rights for some, but those who dared to protest, they would often disappear. And anyone who reads the amnesty reports from 1961 up to the late 70s under the Shah, it's report after report of people disappearing in prison, tortured, solitary confinement, and amnesty adopted many prisoners of conscience. And then with the right of center Shia government in Iraq, from which Payam had to flee as Baha'i, because particularly a strong Muslim government, the Baha'i are seen as apostates, ones who distort authentic Islam, and so this clash between what is genuine Islam and hence those who seem to betray, distort, undermine it, which is Baha'i. And so his family fled, and out of this comes in his Massey lectures of 217. Very personal, a very confessional story of his own journey, but linking it to the larger story of global politics and human rights and some of the organizations and legal documents which, at least in principle, are meant to protect human rights. I'd like to move from Iran over to Saudi Arabia at the present time, because Saudi Arabia, anyone who's been following the news the last few days, particularly the woman who did her studies at UBC, who was in prison for leading and voicing certain concerns with even women's right to drive in Saudi Arabia, has been imprisoned, and UBC and the Canadian government has raised concerns about this. But in Saudi Arabia, certainly under the Saud family, basic political, civil rights are very, very much ignored, and those who dare to protest raise questions. Dissent from the government, as anyone who followed last year, the journalist who was killed in Turkey, constantly, he was a Socratic gadfly to the Saudi government, his treatment as a result of this. But interestingly enough, one can look at Saudi Arabia, and of course the great oil center, the center of Muslim pilgrimages, Mecca, Medina, conservative form of Islam, quite different from Iranian. It's out of this comes the Wahhabist tradition. But Saudi Arabia, both domestically, is known for certainly not being at the cutting edge of political, civil, legal rights. It's war right now in Yemen, in which terrible atrocities are going on there because it feels the Yemeni movement is a threat to Saudi stability, Saudi oil. And so what is interesting, again, when we move into the West on human rights, very few countries in the West which hold high political, civil, legal rights are in any serious or substantive way daring to criticize Saudi Arabia in terms of its treatment of the Yemenis and the war that is going on. In fact, Canada has continued to sell, which was initiated under Harper, but has continued under Trudeau, continued to sell light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia, which obviously are being used in the treatment of their own people and the many foreigners who are cheap pay in Saudi Arabia, but also being used in Yemen and the human rights situation there. So we can in the West can often flatter itself on being a great upholder of political, civil, legal rights. And to some degree it is, as was the Romans in their own time, of their own citizens or those who lived within its borders and jurisdiction. But when those outside its borders threatened it, it was quite willing to abuse, mistreat, and fast forward to today, political, civil, legal rights in countries. And so the first world is very dependent, more or less, on Saudi oil. And so it's not likely to raise a lot of hard questions about Saudi Arabia's treatment of women, foreigners, and immigrants. The Yemeni war, Canada, as I mentioned, selling a very lucrative offer to light armored vehicles in Saudi Arabia, and they're not exactly used for show and tell in a harmless, domesticated and sanitized way. And so political, civil, this is the dilemma of West, is that the political, civil, legal rights are held high, but selectively applied. And when the West is involved with states that they need, either for oil or some other resources, it's often quite willing to wink, wink, nod, nod, and ignore the treatment in those countries or those countries who are mistreating others when it comes to political civil rights. So you get this tension again between economics, big trade relationships, the same with Canada and other states with China. China being an economic superpower, most are not going to seriously raise human rights questions to China, much less, obviously, they're not going to act on them and invade China. The implications would be horrendous. It would have immense implications and ripple effect on the world. One more state then to look at once again how the West will hold high political, civil, legal rights, but often it goes quite silent when states it has an interest in violate those rights. So Israel. Now the West often can argue, okay, we're in a different place than Iran in its understanding of Islam. Yes, we're not supporters, at least in principle, of Wahhabist forms of Sunni Islam. But Israel sees itself, at least in principle, as the only liberal democratic state in the Middle East. And yet the human rights tradition in Israel is one that has, over the decades, sorely mistreated both Christian and Muslim Palestinians. And so the Gaza, for example, is just a dark hellhole in many ways of human rights violations. And getting food in there, going into that part of the country is allowed by only a few. In the West Bank, the constant movement by the Israeli state for settlements, which is again and again making life virtually impossible for many Palestinians. Basic things like freedom of movement, which is supposed to be one of the great improvements, is very much limited in Israel to the Palestinians. East and West Jerusalem, East Jerusalem is increasingly the Palestinians, whether Christians or Muslims, are being marginalized and moved out. And meanwhile, first world states are very hesitant in terms of criticizing Israel. In fact, our present Prime Minister Trudeau, as well as previously Harper, they virtually say nothing about the multiple human rights abuses that go on in Israel in regards to the Palestinians and the refugee camps. And so our own Prime Minister, of course, is very good friends with one of the leading Jewish families, and his major fundraiser is comes from a Jewish family. Hence this Zionist, both Jewish Zionist connection as well as Christian Zionism, which is very essential to both American support of uncritical support of Israel and the human rights situation of the Palestinians, as well as Canadian support for Israel and its impact on basic living conditions and rights for the Palestinians, both Muslim and Christian, within the Middle East. So when we think of international human rights, I looked last week at the Chinese and the Russian tradition, now moving into the Middle East and Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. We can look at how the First World, even though claiming to hold high political, civil, and legal rights, is quite willing to subordinate those rights when it comes to certain economic issues, as in Iran under the Shah, in which very little was said substantively, even though groups like Amnesty International and other groups in conscience raised the issue. Saudi Arabia, again, hardly a paragon of virtue when it comes to human rights. Canada and others engage in substantive oil trade ties with them, will be willing to send tanks to the impact of Yemen. And then Israel and the Palestinians, in which basic political, civil, legal rights are negated, thwarted, undermined for the Palestinians, Christian and Muslim, in this situation. So there is this hypocrisy, there is this duplicity. Interestingly enough, Payam, in search of a better world, being Baha'i, and given the fact that one of the major temples of Baha'i is in Haifa, Israel, he's quite willing to critique many countries which are human rights violators, but he does not, in his Massey lectures, dare to critique Israel, which is fascinating, in which this, on the one hand, seemingly idealistic thinker and activist for human rights at various levels, when it comes to Israel, it's like we don't touch Israel, and of course the sad impact of that on the Palestinians themselves. And so international human rights, then, I've focused a little bit this time on political, civil, legal rights, which are considered part of first-generation rights, and looked at both within countries in which these are perpetually violated, but how the first world is implicated and complicit in those ongoing violations of human rights. In the readings for this course, can you read, obviously, Lecture 1 in the CBC Massey Lectures in terms of In Search of a Better World.